Hello and welcome everybody. We're back this week with Dr. Eban Alexander. And in the Wyrd World of Knowing, as we all know, we've all got our weird little ways. Dr. Eban Alexander has been on a very wonderful experience, which resulted in him writing this book, which is called The Proof of Heaven. And I read this book in a day. I couldn't put it down. And as soon as I'd read it, I was straight on my little PC putting in, I have to email and see if this wonderful guy can actually come on to our show. And here he is. And I can't tell you how excited I am that he is here. So welcome, Dr. Eban Alexander.
Well, Rachel, thanks so much for having me on. It's great to be with you today.
Oh, it's an absolute joy. It really is. Now, you are a neurosurgeon.
Yes.
So for you to write a book that is saying there is proof of heaven is really quite interesting in itself. So I'm going to let you go straight in if that's okay, and just tell people what is proof of heaven for you. Why did you feel that you needed to write this book?
Well, this is really all about the scientific study of the brain-mind connection and the nature of consciousness. That's what this discussion is ultimately about, not about any kind of religious beliefs, but about personal experience in large numbers and about the modern scientific attempts to explain all that. And the interesting thing is, I wrote this book because I had come along in the very conventional tradition of scientific education of the 20th and 21st century. That is the notion of materialism or physicalism, that only the physical world exists, and therefore the brain must somehow muster consciousness out of purely physical matter. Now, I'd struggle with that, as have so many other scientists trying to understand the brain mind connection. And as much as I wanted to believe all I'd been taught in my Methodist church growing up, and that my father, who was a globally renowned academic neurosurgeon, very scientific, but also he was deeply spiritual. He believed in power of prayer and a loving personal God and all of that. But growing up in the 60s and 70s, I always knew science was the pathway to truth, but like so many in our culture, I made the mistake of thinking that materialism or physicalism was going to lead us to a deeper understanding. And the reality is that model, that assumption of the physical universe being all that exists is very erroneous, and it leads us the wrong direction. And where my journey led me, and this was mainly based on the medical details of my case, I had a perfect model for human death in the form of a severe gram-negative bacterial meningoencephalitis involving all lobes of my brain and my brainstem. And that is by wiping out the neocortex. That's what makes it such a perfect model for human death, because all the details of conscious awareness, according to modern neuroscience, are generated in the neocortex itself. Now, that there's a lot more to the brain involvement in consciousness, but the details of what we see, what we hear, what we smell, sense, body awareness, memories of past events, executive function for future, every bit of that is hinged in the neocortex. And that's why meningitis is such a perfect model for death, because it disables that cortex. And I had one of the most severe cases in medical history that involved a recovery. In fact, it's unprecedented in the medical literature. There's a medical case report on my medical records in September 2018 Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases that makes it very clear. It was written by 3 doctors not involved in my care, but fascinated by my recovery. And that case report makes it very clear 2 major findings that I tried to argue in my book, Proof of Heaven, but these scientists, as objective reviewers, strengthened greatly. One is that my brain was in no shape to harbor any kind of dream or hallucination, much less the most extraordinary, multifaceted, detailed, transformational set of events in my entire life. How did that happen when my brain was so demonstrably inactivated? That's the key kind of question. But then the other that was raised uh, by the peer reviewers of the journal, actually, they said this case is absurd. No one this sick actually makes a full recovery. How do you explain it? And that's where the 3 doctors who wrote the case report said it's because he had a near death experience. That's what enabled this to happen, this kind of miraculous healing. And it's because they knew of other similar cases of NDEs, that is near death experiences, in the setting of a miraculous healing from a disease, like Anita Morjani's healing of her lymphoma. She
Mm.
wrote the book Dying to Be Me.
Yeah, so
Or,
can we backtrack just a little, just so
oh,
that the listeners can get a little bit of context for this? So you've been a little bit poorly at home, and basically your wife had eventually phoned the ambulance to get you to hospital. How quickly was it from you actually having any symptoms at all, to you actually being seen, and going into this coma? How fast was that process?
well, I went into coma at home between 4:30 and about 7:30 in the morning on November 10th, 2008. There's some confusion in articles about my case that pretend that I was in a medically induced coma. That's completely untrue. As the medical case report makes clear, and Dr. Bruce Grayson in his book After in chapter 10, which is pretty much exclusively about my case, makes very clear. Um, I went into coma at home without any medications at all. And I was deep in coma that whole week, and in fact, emerged from coma after 7 days while still on very heavy sedating medication. So, very important to point out this was not a medically induced coma, it was induced by the meningitis. And that's why the scientific community can take it so seriously as a counterexample to what they believe is a working model for how the brain creates consciousness. Because in my case, that doesn't fit at all. In fact, my highest levels of consciousness when my brain was at its greatest disablement by this disease. So
So
that's where
yeah,
the scientific
just into
community takes it.
context for the listeners. So what was actually happening with your body, and what chance of survival had you been given by the medical team when all of this was going on?
Well, so I'm at home having seizures, in coma. That's when the EMTs came, tried to break the seizures, took me off to Lynchburg General Hospital, where I'd worked as a neurosurgeon off and on for 2 years. And in fact, Dr. Laura Potter, who was a good friend of mine, and worked with her on patients there. She didn't even recognize me. She just heard the nurses say, 54-year-old white male in extremis trying to die on her watch, status epilepticus. She knew immediately that meningitis might be the culprit, did a lumbar puncture, and thick white pus came out under pressure. She told me months later that when she saw that, knowing that I went into coma over just a few hours, she knew my chances of living through this illness were about 10%. That
Right.
was early in the week. And that projection became only worse during 7 days on three powerful intravenous antibiotics on a ventilator with declining neurologic picture. I mean, it was just a horror show for my doctors and my family. And that's when they recommended at the end of those 7 days, they said I'd gone from a 10% chance of survival to 2%, but there was no realistic prospect of any meaningful recovery. They'd not seen cases in the literature of somebody this ill from gram-negative bacterial meningoencephalitis making significant recovery towards normal. And that's why they recommended just letting me go. That's what they told my family that Sunday morning. And it was a few hours later I started coming back to this world. But when I did, just as they had predicted, my brain was absolutely wrecked by this. I
Mm.
didn't even recognize my loved ones at the bedside, my mother, my sisters, my sons. I had no idea who these beings were on that awakening on day 7. All I knew is where I'd just been, that extraordinary journey deep in coma, this whole story that I tell in Proof of Heaven, which all is are a set of events that completely violated everything neuroscience says about the brain and mind and consciousness. And that's why I knew my story was very important. And the healing itself, I mean, in all of history, we paid attention when people have miraculous healings. And of course, some people deny miracles ever happen, but doctors will tell you there are spontaneous remissions and other cases of extraordinary healing. And it's not uncommon to find them in the setting of a near death experience. And all this does is awaken us to the reality of the primacy of mind and that we are much more than just our physical body. And the consciousness is much more than just the epiphenomenon or kind of side effect of chemical reactions and electron fluxes in the brain, which is the mistake that conventional science has always made about consciousness and the nature of reality. And so where science is going now, and I work with hundreds of scientists around the world, is towards a model where we see a consciousness as fundamental and united, this kind of God mind of the universe that we're all sharing. And that when we leave our physical body at the time of death, our conscious awareness doesn't shrivel down to nothing, as materialism would predict, but it actually expands tremendously, which is what near death experiencers have been telling us thousands of years
Mhm.
across all countries, belief systems, uh, millennia, etc. These lessons are very fundamental in teaching us that we're not just one body, birth to death, nothing more, but that we have ongoing life. I mean, the whole concept of reincarnation is heavily supported by scientific research. For example, out of University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies, uvadops.org, you can see a lot of information gained over 6 decades by very skeptical, smart scientists that basically indicate the reality of this one mind that we all share, and that the brain is viewed more as a filter transceiver that allows each of us to access a little eddy current of that primordial mind, but that ultimately the important thing to get is that we're part of this primordial eternal mind and thus are eternal souls all working together in this process of learning and teaching and growth. It's a complete 180-degree flip from the bleak and paltry fiction of materialist science, which pretends that at death, all consciousness is extinguished, and that there's absolutely nothing to our mental experience, that it's just an accident. The
This is
current science is defying every bit of that in a revolution that will really help humanity.
so just give us a little bit of a taster, if you can, of what that reality was when you went off in your coma.
Well, it's important to point out that one of the atypical features of my near death experience is that I was amnesic, that I had no memory of Eban Alexander's life throughout the coma experience and no knowledge of humans, of Earth, none of my religious preconceptions. Every bit of that was gone at the door, at the entry.
Mm,
And I had this empty slate. Now, even though it's unusual for NDEs, I attempted to explain that in the first weeks when I came back, when I still didn't have all my neuroscience knowledge back.
mm,
That took about 2 months. Um, but I thought, given the damage my doctors were reporting about my neocortex, it made sense that my memories would be very distorted and eliminated. But the amazing thing was how those memories were coming back very rapidly.
mm,
In fact, over 2 months, I found that my memories had returned to a point where they were more complete than they had been before the coma. And
mm.
that's something we discussed in detail in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, is that memory is not even stored in the brain. That's one of the last nails in the coffin of materialist neuroscience, but it has everything to do with this evolving model of consciousness that is
So
supported by science.
where is memory stored then?
It's stored in what I would call the Akashic record of the quantum hologram. That is the information field of all possibilities. In fact, all of the physical universe, our experience of it, is emergent from that integrated information field of the mental layer of the universe, which I like how Edgar Mitchell, Apollo 14 astronaut, in a paper that he and Bob Starrett wrote in the book on quantum consciousness, they called it the quantum hologram, and it's that information field that we all have access to.
Mm,
But the interesting finding of quantum physics, especially acknowledged by the 2022 Nobel Prize
yeah.
for entanglement for spooky accident at a distance, is they're finally admitting, at the Nobel Prize Committee level, that all of our prior concepts of space and time and materialism and all working on that stage of space time is not true. That there's a deeper reality that's interconnected across space and time, and that's what entanglement is all about. And I'm
Yeah.
sure there are quantum physicists who will fight it, but ultimately, the answer to the question of what can this possibly represent, this field of universal connection, it's the field of the mind, of mental awareness, the mental universe. And that is something we have access to.
Ah,
And it's a far more influential level of the universe than the material realm itself. That's why,
that is music to my ears, because as an energy therapist who takes people on um, many journeys within themselves to find their own inner knowing, their own knowledge, their own reasons of ancestral knowledge that they can claim their own superpowers to move forward with. That is music to my ears. So how do you help people now with the information that you've had from going from your coma, your neurosurgeon brain that you have now to relating everything for people to move forward with? What's happening now?
Well, really, a lot of things. So, for example, on a daily basis, I work with scientists around the world. For example, the group GalileoCommission.org, another group, scientificandmedical.net. Both of these groups, based in Europe, strongly support this complete flip in worldviews in the scientific community, where we see mind as fundamental. And it ultimately then points to the fact that we are spiritual beings in a spiritual universe. And when I use the word spiritual, it doesn't have to do with religion, even though religions can serve a beautiful function of enhancing spirituality, but they don't always. In fact, some religions and their ideologies get in the way of spirituality, which is sad, but true. But this emerging science of consciousness is much more kind of universal in its portrayal of this kind of God force of benevolence as it's revealed through the near death experience community, where
Mm.
something like 90 to 95% of the experiences originate in this beautiful, loving oneness of benevolence at the core of the universe. In fact, 90% of people who have had near death experiences, even if they were atheist or agnostic before, 90% of them come back after the experience believing in some form of a loving, benevolent force at the core of the universe, a God force. And I realized from my journey that it doesn't matter if you want to try and label that as God or Allah, Brahman, Vishnu, Jehovah, Yahweh. Ultimately, those definitions are petty little human attempts to own and kind of manipulate the reality of a fundamental force of pure creation and love, that God force at the core of the universe. And if 90% of NDEers come back believing that force is absolutely real, I think the rest of us should take heed. Now, we also do a lot of work in addition to writing the book Living in a Mindful Universe, which is really the proof of heaven that people are looking for. That's the scientific expose that reveals our spiritual nature. But in addition to all that, I do workshops around the world with my life partner, Karen Newell, who I've been with for 11 plus years now. Karen is the co-founder of Sacred Acoustics. It's a form of binaural beat brainwave entrainment. And we give workshops all around the world, uh, both by Zoom and in person, that help people come into a richer sense of self by using differential frequency brainwave entrainment to help them access their higher soul. It's basically a way of, because these sounds, uh, binaural beats are slightly different frequencies to the two ears that have an influence down in the lower brainstem. So every sound you've ever heard that might have engendered a chant or anthem or hymn that might have engendered a transcendental state of conscious awareness, those are all processed up in the temporal lobes in the acoustic cortex and circuits that have basically evolved in the last 2 to 3 million years in primates and Homo sapiens. Very different from the processing of sacred acoustics and similar binaural beat brainwave entrainment. Those are all processed in the lower brainstem, processed at a level in the brain that evolved more than 300 million years ago. There's a general principle in biology that you look at anatomy and evolution to kind of get to the heart of function. So if
Mm.
we're looking at the function of consciousness, we look at the brain and its anatomy going back in evolution, and that's where we find the power of invoking this circuit that measures the arrival time of these sounds and how it can give us a slow wavering sensation in the lower brainstem that is very powerful at liberating conscious awareness from the illusion of here, now, and sense of self.
Oh, I could listen to this forever. This is just beautiful. Thank you so much. So, moving forward, I'm glad you mentioned the Galileo Commission because we've had Vasilius Basius on here because he's very much involved in the weird experience at Broughton Sanctuary and bringing together the latest innovation of what's happening with random event generators with Jeff Dunn, Brenda Dunn, sadly who's now passed away. Um, and all of the information that you're giving here ties in beautifully. So if anybody wants to listen back to Vasilius's podcast episode, I'll put that link in there as well, so you can actually make that correlation to the Galilean Commission. So how can we as a collective move forward with this information that you're gathering?
Well, for one thing, I would point out another very valuable repository of information proving scientifically the reality of the afterlife. Go to bigelowinstitute.org. Back in 2021, Robert Bigelow ran a contest globally. He challenged the scientific community what's the best evidence for continuation of consciousness after permanent bodily death. He had lost his wife, his son had committed suicide. He wanted to know more about where they were. This contest uh, received more than 1,000 applications. They made it clear you had to show at least 5 years of scientific experience with rigorous investigation of the afterlife question. In that setting, they received 204 essays. They were going to give out 3 monetary awards. They ended up giving out 29 monetary awards because the papers were so good. And all 29 of those papers are available for free to the reading public now. It's
Right.
no longer a question of whether the afterlife is real. The scientific evidence comes down very strongly showing that afterlife and reincarnation are huge parts of human experience. And it's up to the scientific community and humanity at large to figure out how that all works. But the evidence that these are real effects is beyond dispute. So start with Jeffrey Mishlov's first place essay there, and you will find incredibly powerful multidisciplinary arguments for the reality of the afterlife. So we move beyond the question of is this scientifically valid? We know it's absolutely scientifically valid, and we just have a lot more questions to answer about the fundamental nature of consciousness. But we realize that consciousness is ultimately unified, that we're all sharing one consciousness, and that ultimately that binding force is really one of love. So that the more we manifest kindness, compassion, mercy, acceptance, when necessary, forgiveness, uh, ultimately unconditional love is the best kind of tool for us to use in our interactions with self and with the world at large.
Right.
And these are very dramatically different messages compared to our conventional cultural messages from materialism that we are separate beings and that we're in competition. All this kind of came along in the 20th century with discussions of Darwinian evolution. Darwin himself was not really the villain.
Mm.
In the book, The Descent of Man, he uses the phrase, uh, survival of the fittest twice. He uses the word love 98 times. So it wasn't him, but it was like Thomas Huxley, another very militant atheist who were trying to hijack any concept of evolution and turn it into a brutal mechanistic battle for survival where only the topmost survive. And any biologist will tell you that's a false narrative, that cooperation and collaboration are the keys to success in the biological kingdom and in evolution. So anyway, the reality is we're finally getting to a point now where we're overcoming the complete nonsense of materialist thinking, and it's teaching of this false sense of separation from each other. Because NDEs show you very clearly we are sharing that mental space. When
Yeah.
people have profound NDEs, they connect with souls of departed loved ones. They can have connection with living minds that are at a distance now of other loved ones, et cetera. It's showing that mental space and how it is not something that comes to an end with the death of a physical body. And that is the important lesson for all of us. There's so much fear of death in our culture. It dominates so much of how we think and interact with each other. And if we realize that we're all truly in this together and
Yeah.
we're here to take care of each other, which is exactly what the deepest principles of this revolution in thinking about consciousness based on near death experiences, shared death experiences, and all the other investigations of consciousness that we outline in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, all of it leads towards an incredible revolution of humanity that will lead us to a much more prosperous, harmonious, and peaceful world.
Gosh, absolutely. And of course, this isn't just near death experiences, is it? People are having meditative visualizations, experiences all the time. The deeper that they go into themselves, they're having these connections with the Akashic records and all sorts of things. In fact, I've been on a personal journey myself at the moment, and I'm finding myself going to visit the stone circles in the UK, and there are 14 specific stone circles that I need to go and visit. And that started at the foot of our country in Cornwall, starting there, and I'm working my way up the country. Now, that's not something that I would have ever imagined that I would do. It's not something that I would have really just thought, oh, well, yeah, I'll just go and visit the stone circles. That's something that's been
We have to
really
follow our
downloaded.
heart.
Yeah, well, there's hundreds of stone circles in this country, in the UK, but these 14 specific ones um, seem very important to me, and it's very important that I go on this journey from foot to crown. It also seems to be very important that I have to do this in the month of May, which is actually when King Charles is going to be crowned in the coronation.
Yes.
Crowning is again that ring is very important. And for me, this is very much symbolistic, but very important physical pilgrimage that I need to go to these places to actually crown my own sovereignty and that of others. That yeah, we can do this, but we do have to go on some sort of pilgrimage. There is some sort
Right.
of um risk somewhere. And for you, yours was an extreme case of a near death experience. Mine isn't hopefully as that is extreme, but for me, still a difficult maneuvering of putting myself in situations that I wouldn't normally choose to be in.
Right.
What a beautiful journey it's put me on.
Well,
That c-
that is beautiful to hear, and I'm so glad you're following your heart.
yeah.
That is really what this is all about, and this is why one of the things that we try and teach in our meditation workshop is you are not that little voice in your head, your running stream of thoughts in your head. So many people identify with that and say, "That's who I am." And I love how Michael Singer in his book, The Untethered Soul, he calls that running stream of thoughts in your head your annoying roommate. And that's a beautiful way to look at it. Very important because we're so used to in our culture, using that little ego mind, that little linguistic voice in the head and following the breadcrumbs of logic and rational thought to try and take us to some understanding of reality. And that only works if the information input is excellent, and it's usually not.
Mm,
So this is about opening yourselves up to the wisdom of your higher soul and of that primordial mind. And so in meditation, what we teach people to do is to use these sacred acoustics tones, and people can go to sacredacoustics.com to learn more. But use them to just kind of let your that little ego mind state a request, ask a question, make an intention, what have you. But then you can let that little ego voice go into timeout because you learn through meditation, especially using these powerful techniques like sacred acoustics. You learn how to connect with your higher soul, traversing the veil, leaving your little ego far behind. And that's the important step is opening yourself up to your higher wisdom and your higher soul. And that's what all of us have access to as we traverse the veil with these kinds of tools. And you come to realize that near death experiences, in many ways, just reflect the natural dying process. People think near death experiences, which are said to occur in 15 to 20% of people who come close to death, they think, well, there's some kind of exotic thing, not for me. And yet the reality is, if you look, for example, at the hospice literature, uh, book by Christopher Kerr, Death is But a Dream, came out about 3, 4 years ago. He's a hospice worker in Buffalo, New York, and he makes it crystal clear that 86% of the patients in his practice had very profound, uh, more real than real events of encountering souls of departed loved ones, encountering a God force, all of that as they were making the transition. So near death experiences are just the tip of the spear in explaining what is a common observation about people making that transition. It's not that little obliteration that materialist science keeps pretending it is. It's an awakening and a profound kind of coming into existence with higher soul and remembering much greater aspects of a much longer journey than just one incarnation. And that's really the beauty of it. But the good news is you don't have to wait to your deathbed to get this. By cultivating an active practice of meditation, 10 or 20, 30 minutes a day, I try to meditate 40 to 60 minutes a day when I can. I find it tremendously valuable. For me, it's a tremendous If nothing else, it allows for relaxation that is extraordinary. In fact, there's a peer-reviewed scientific study supporting sacred acoustics for anxiety in a busy New York Manhattan practice, written by Dr. Anna Yusuf, came out in February 2020 in the Journal of Nervous Mental Diseases, where she talks directly about how 26% of her patients over 2 weeks had tremendous relief of their anxiety symptoms versus only 7% in the control group that received conventional talk therapy. So just using these differential frequency sounds can be a tremendous boon in helping people get into a very kind of neutral, comfortable state with their higher soul. And that's a huge part of it as you come into a realization that all is well. And it certainly helps you to kind of navigate a pathway forward that involves soul growth, learning and teaching, manifesting these lessons of love and compassion and kindness for others, and using that to bring that kindness into our own heart and soul and into our own journey. So it's really by living what we discover there. But I think you're following that same higher soul pathway in seeking out these 16 stone circles.
Yeah.
I congratulate you on following your heart. That's a beautiful thing to do, and that's what everyone can learn to do, is come into a richer sense of their meaning and purpose in their lives by spending that time going within and not just thinking about things and daydreaming, but letting that ego mind go intentionally into timeout so that you can open yourself to the awareness of your higher soul.
There really is magic in the weird, isn't there? Really is magic because when you do give yourself permission to go on these little journeys that are a little bit out of the extraordinary, it brings things into your life that are so unexpectedly beautiful.
Well, it really does,
Would
and
not
to
have planned
me,
it.
that points out the importance of belief.
Mm,
Our beliefs, and as Soren Kierkegaard said, there are two ways to be fooled. One is refusing to believe what is true, and the other is believing something that's not true.
mm,
And we've got to be very careful because our beliefs, especially our cultural beliefs, in many ways are falsely limiting. They teach us, no, you can't do that. That's impossible. No can do. As opposed to realizing that all of reality is ultimately generated out of this mental space.
mm.
And the more we can ultimately kind of connect with that higher soul, that interconnected mental space with the higher souls of others and with that God force co creating with us, the more we can bring the world of our dreams into fruition. So,
And it makes
question
people
authority and push the limits with meditation, centering prayer, to achieve healing and bring that wholeness and happiness and joy and bliss into your life and that of others through connection with higher soul, with that primordial mind.
and it is bliss, isn't it? I mean, I know what it feels like because I take myself there as often as I possibly can. But can you give people an explanation as to what that experience feels like?
Well, I would say you recognize it because it feels so familiar. It's a spiritual home.
Mm,
I mentioned a little while ago the scientific studies out of UVA on past life memories in children indicative of reincarnation. And currently, they have more than 2,700 cases they've investigated. And over 1,700 of those cases are called solved. That is, they found the person who actually lived, who the child is reporting. And those are extraordinary cases. And they really kind of show us the power of this kind of knowledge and understanding if we have the wisdom to pursue it deeply and get into, personal exploration of these kind of fields. But the reason I bring all that up now is that those doctors, Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker, who have headed up this research over 6 decades of past life memories in children showing reincarnation, will tell you you must harvest those memories before age 6 or 7 because there are natural processes in all of us that cover those memories over. So that most of us as teenagers and adults don't still have memories of past lives and between lives, but many children do. And that's the important thing to remember is that you can recover these memories through things like meditation, centering prayer, hypnotic regression, having an NDE, having some spiritually transformative experience, often some kind of life trauma. It might be a terminal diagnosis in a loved one or something like that. But these kind of traumatic, challenging events are what kind of push us towards the edge to further define this kind of connection we have with our higher soul and its abilities to bring healing and wholeness into our lives. So I think it's important for people to recognize the scientific study fully supports reincarnation and the afterlife kind of events. And now it's up to each and every one of us individually to explore our consciousness and go deep into that kind of non-local, non-self of the primordial mind to more readily discover the things we need to know for our soul growth in the here and now.
Well, I can't thank you enough for bringing science and consciousness together so succinctly, so beautifully, and sharing this time with us. I'm sure people have got so many questions that they want to follow on from this. So if you do, please do get in touch and we can forward all those on to Dr. Eban Alexander. And I'm sure he and his team will answer them the best that they possibly can for you. Much more
Well, and people
scientifically than I certainly can.
good. Well, I would just add people can reach out to Eben, EBEN Alexander.com, also sacredacoustics.com. And also, I'd recommend a free set of interviews we did during the pandemic with all the many people, the world leaders in consciousness studies, other experiencers, et cetera. That's available at INNER, sanctumcenter.com. Again, multiple avenues there, but certainly that free set of webinars is very helpful to people who want to get on board with all of this.
Oh, absolutely. I'll certainly be checking that out and I will put that into the comments under this podcast, everybody. So this will be going out on YouTube as well. So all that information will be there for you. And thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure having you here. And I'll see you very soon.
Well, thank you, Rachel. It's great talking with you, and I look forward to the next time.
Thank you.